And sometimes they weren't that obscene, but anyway, they would print the pornography, usually in Switzerland and other liberal places like that. They would smuggle them along with political propaganda and other prohibited texts, and then they would have to sell them. Well, in the bookstore, you couldn't really put books of pornography, so they would actually have chapters, essentially, in other books. And sometimes you would buy a book and unexpectedly open it up and it's like, oh, interesting.
It's like slash fiction.
Right.
Just already in the book for you.
Or steampunk magazine. Oh, surprise! That was one way. It wasn't the only way. Other ways is that they would put it in between the pages and you would have to cut the pages. Or just put a different title on it, like Winnie the Pooh.
Different cover.
And then you would open it and be like, oh. And these were called yellow books, and you would go in and ask, do you have any yellow books? And they would be like, oh yes, I have Winnie the Pooh and Steampunk Magazine, and Pride and Prejudice with dildos fit. I'm sure that's copyrighted.
That hasn't come out yet. We haven't finished writing that yet.
But you would ask for these yellow books. It's also the craze of the miniature book at this time. Little teeny books you had to read with a magnifying glass. That was perfect for pornography. You could smuggle it, take it, move it around, and hide it on the top shelf away from the kids, and the wife, and the husband, and the maid, and anybody else.
So nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
Not really.
So, the pornographers also, the biggest problem though, if you didn't want to smuggle it in, because it was fairly expensive, and the reality is Switzerland, for the most part, was publishing things in German and French, and you wanted to give to an English audience. So you would have your writers writing one-handedly their erotic texts, and you would get them to you, and you would have to publish them. So it's like, well, that's not a problem. I can use miniatures, I can use Winnie the Pooh, I can use Steampunk Magazine, I can do all these different things. But how do I get it printed? Because that was the weak link in this whole chain. Because the printer would get raided, and they would say, where did you get this? And it would be like, Professor Calamity gave me this sketchy thing, and then I would be arrested. So... Again.
Not for the first time.
That's a different panel. In Salisbury, this is a true story, in 1867, a print shop opened up and said, hire our services, not because we're necessarily the cheapest, or that we're necessarily the best, but all the printers that we hire are legally blind. The reason was because the law required the printer to read the text and say, yes, this is the plates I put together. And the blind people would just use Braille to feel and they would get it orally told to them so that they couldn't use it as evidence against the publishers. They would also use foreign language people and all sorts of things, or they would eventually have to buy their own printing presses. And in the book, you'll hear about some of the interesting ways. Sometimes a printer would only print every other sentence, and another printer would print every other sentence. And so that you would have this huge chain of printers, and the same paper would bounce. So when you go to the Library of Erotica, called the Forbidden Texts at the British National Library, where Karl Marx spent a lot of time. Just a little side note. A lot of the actual texts are all kind of poorly laid out, as we would say today. But that was part of the strategy. And I could talk about Eric Dingwall, great name, all day. He was a child prodigy and also the person that collected all the pornographic manuscripts, most of them, for the British Library.
But as a child?
No, not as a child. He graduated from Oxford at age 15, and they said, okay, you can do whatever you want to do. And he says, I want to be a librarian. That's a good wholesome thing. And what do you want to study? I want to collect all the erotic and disgusting texts I can. And they said, oh, well, you are a genius. So they set him up, and he went around the world and collected all these texts. And they said, well, you weren't kidding when you said you were going to grab erotic and disgusting texts. We're going to lock these away. And they locked them away for about 55 years. But it's quite an impressive collection.
There's also, you can talk more about porn.
No,
I think we're done with
I
porn.
think we're done with porn.
Till the
I was
question
just gonna say,
section.
I was just gonna say with the erotica stuff, the erotica they were writing, like, a lot of this was not tame. This was like not even stuff that like I would want to read or discuss in polite company. And in my version of polite company, can talk about a lot of stuff. But this stuff was like really wrong, some of it. And if you ever want to look at the history of erotica, you will find some things that will make you want to put bleach on your eyeballs and or go do things.
Or you'll turn out like us. Nobody wants that.
Should we talk a little bit more about other printed materials? Non-pornography?
Pornography,
What were you
like
talking about?
almanacs or what?
Yes, that's
The history of the almanac goes back to the Doomsday Book of 1660.
I was kind of thinking.
He's probably
more-
actually going to talk about almanacs.
Yeah. No, I was more thinking of the mother-in-law whispers.
Yeah,
nice.
the advice books.
Isn't that okay? We need to,
Anyone know
we
what
need to
that
take
is?
it down a notch and calm it down. Anybody know what Mother-in-Law Whispers is? It's a type of book. Oh, we got a hand. Yes.
What's
The mother-in-law gives it to the bride. And what's it about?
Yeah.
Otherwise known as sex. It doesn't really have a lot to do
She's
about
not married, but she
invitation.
doesn't know that.
Oh, you're not married. I'm sorry. You'll find out.
When you get that book from your future mother-in-law, that's got to be an embarrassing
So they
moment.
were called Mother-in-Law Whispers. Kind of bizarre, and actually as creepy as any of the raunchy Victorian sex I read about was imagining a mother-in-law saying, "Here you go."
Over tea.
Over tea. She would take you out. It was a whole ceremony. Would take you out and then just kind of slip you this thing. That didn't come out the way I planned.
Yes, it did.
Would hand you this primer.
Hand you.
And there were three types. One was what you would expect the Victorians, and this was called the proper type. And one of my favorite lines, well, you want to do it? You do it so well. One of my favorite lines from it.
Well, what? I would misquote it, but it was basically, sex is something you do rarely and begrudgingly.
And that was actually the subtitle of the actual text. So you can imagine how excited you must be for your wedding. Oh, this is something I'm going to do rarely and begrudgingly.
That's also the subtitle of A Steampunk's Guide to Sex, isn't it?
You'll read it rarely and begrudgingly, but you will read it. Other ones were weirdly clinical. Kind of like our sex ed classes today, without all the glamour. It was anatomical texts, actual like, here is the muscles you will use during sex. And here is what a close-up of a vagina looks like in pen and ink. And it would cover 2 pages. And you'd be like, what the hell is this? And they would also talk about diseases. They would talk about parasites. They would talk about pubic hair and why it's colored, the way it's colored and why it curls. And you can imagine some bride, 16-year-old bride being like, thanks, Mom. I've got it. The other one were more what we would consider primers on sex. A lot of them were taken from the East, the Kama Sutra being the most classic, which was first translated popularly by Sir Richard Burton, who, not the actor, but the explorer who found the Nile. I could go on about all of his sexual stuff, very interesting. I will just tell you,
Well,
he has an essay, this is not a lie, you can check it up. He has an essay talking about the peculiar sexual nature of camels. This essay is 62 pages long.
You could call it a monograph.
He did call it a monograph. And
There
he
we go.
presented it at the the Royal Geographic Society. I think I feel uncomfortable. He must have felt a lot more
So
uncomfortable.
furries have been around for a while?
Furries. You went there, I didn't.
We weren't going there.
So, God,
I'm getting beat up after this.
I gotta wash the camels out of my mind for a second. Where was I? Oh, so Kama Sutra was a common one. It actually had illustrations and gave you information that you could actually use on your wedding night. And these were the 3 types. And what's interesting is they broke down by class. If you tended to be wealthy, you tended to get the first type, the begrudging. If you tended to be middle class, because there was science, this is where science doesn't get an applause, you get the 2-page diagram of the vagina and all its capillaries and all its parts. If you tended to be poor, you got some bootleg copy of the Kama Sutra, and I think overall you were pretty happy with that. So those were different types of printing that were available, and those are kind of the first sex guides that were published in the West. Obviously, the Kama Sutra is much older. There were other tantric guides that were translated by people like F.J. Budgie and things like that. All these stolid scholars with big beards and didn't look very sexual, translating these incredibly sexual and romantic texts.
Okay, that's enough about the British.
Yes, all right.
Let's talk about the Wild West.
Shady ladies?
The shady ladies of the Wild West.
Are there any shady ladies in the house? Yeah. What happened to, okay, a little slow. Let me try it again. Are there any shady ladies in the house? No. Oh. That's right. Well, that's the thing. Fine shady. Shady did not mean you were a prostitute.
Hold on. Does it count if you're a certain shade?
Oh!
Snap. Okay.
Someone needs to pull up a chair for her up here. All right. Cover the legs with this creep up here. So,
sit in the front of things.
Remember the doilies and the piano?
You'll remember not to sit in the front row for a sex talk again, that I promise you. Shady Ladies of the West. This is a whole section in the soon-to-be published Steampunk's Guide to Sex, because I find it pretty interesting. More interesting than camels.
I should hope so.
So, Shady Ladies of the West. The thing I want to say seriously, though, is that sex work during the Victorian age, we have to understand it in a kind of economic analysis. Not that I'm going to throw up a pie chart or anything like that, don't worry. But you have to understand that sex work was something that was done often part-time, on the side, because so many people were economically in peril.
Mostly by poor people.
Yeah, I mean, most sex work was done by poor people, or if you needed, you couldn't go to a bank and get a loan. Your cow dies. Okay, I'm making sure this doesn't go the wrong way.
Not the way
camels.
I had to pause.
No.
Get it all out of your system now, kids. Okay, so your cow dies.
Keep it in your system.
And you need to... so your cow dies.
I think the whole herd died by now. So you're going to have to do
You
a lot of
need
side
money,
work.
and you have to do some side work, and you don't have an education, and it's very limited. So you would do sex work for a while. And that was considered actually okay. It was understood. In fact, most of the female businesses, and there were quite a few, both in America and in the UK, if there was a woman that had set up a haberdashery, it was assumed that to get the money, she had to do some kind of sex work for a short period that didn't ruin her reputation forever. It was considered a normal part of the economic perilousness of everyday existence. They understood that sometimes you couldn't just go and find a job. So that being said, Shady Ladies were a large group that did include sex workers, but not only sex workers, female gamblers were quite common. Madams, people that owned bordellos and cat houses, and one of my favorite, painted cages.
What's the difference between a bordello and a cat house?
I don't know.
Okay, so we're just using synonyms. I thought I was
Yes.
missing something.
No,
Okay.
no.
Someone Google it, please.
Somebody Google.
Sorry, no, never mind.
This isn't Catch the Professor.
No, I thought there would be a difference, and
I'm sure there is, I just don't know it.
Okay.
Check out the second book.
Yeah.
So what do you want to...
cat houses?
Cat houses. What do you want to... What do you want?
Mirror theater.
Okay, so there were a number of different can-can dancers, which we're going to talk about later. Fascinating. Stay around, if nothing else.
For the can-can.
For the can-can. We're doing the can. Two of us are in skirts. I will manage this troupe. It's going to be quite a sexy show. But can-can is very interesting. We're going to talk about it. One of the things I find most interesting that you never see in Old West movies or even depictions of the night is mirror theater. Mirror theater was very, very popular. And it was a form of sex work that we just don't have today, probably for good reasons. But so an actress, and she would run her own show usually, because it was a one-woman show. And the idea is it was called mirror theater because it would be a vanity without any glass. So like a sitting vanity. And she would sit there and have these whole monologues as she got dressed and undressed, pretending to entertain various lovers, getting into fights with her mother-in-law. All this stuff is very peculiar. But men, especially in the Old West, you know, hundreds of these cowboys would roll in and just watch this woman put on clothes, take off clothes, and have these long monologues in front of a mirror, which of course wasn't a mirror because you could see what she was doing. And many of those women also then engaged in prostitution. It was assumed that all actresses engaged in prostitution, which is not true. And certainly saloon dancers were very careful to point out they were not prostitutes. And that brings us to
Can-can. So, well, you know what it is, right? Well, the interesting thing about, yeah, well, I don't think we're properly trained for that. But the interesting thing about can-can was that it came from France, indeed, but it was actually a male dance because it's very physical. And the ladies of the Wild West...
I'll just point out that you spend more calories dancing the can-can than almost any other aerobic exercise.
Well, that's why it's making a comeback. But the ladies of the Old West really took it on because A, it was great exercise, and B,
you were watching their figure.
They were watching
as were the cowboys.
figures. But as the professor pointed out, they were not prostitutes. They were very adamant about that, and their audiences would get quite close. So they would actually intentionally kick off the hats of the cowboys that were in the front row and getting a little too close to keep them away. So it was essentially used as self-defense. It was almost like a martial art. There's a great story of
Klondike
Kate and her troupe of can-can dancers.
That's the other thing you should say about the can-can dancers, is they were a troupe. One could almost call them a gang. They would travel from cowtown to cowtown, and there were many burlesque dances in France at the time. Can-can came over really because it was considered a good self-defense dance. They also carried weapons, which helped too.
Well, so there were a couple of things. One was, you know, the skirts are lifted and there's like all these complicated steps. It's actually not that simple of a dance. But the big thing was you would see their garters and you would actually see their weapons, and that was intentional. So you could see their guns or daggers or whatever they were carrying.
That's not slang for something else, seeing her guns, just to be clear. These were derringers.
So it was a male dance.
Well, that was the...
I was going with the
guns
thing.
got it.
Yeah. So that was part of it. The other part of it that...
Sometimes he shoots blanks, it's all right.
The other part that Margaret really liked was the whole story of the drawers. And I'm not going to bore you with Victorian undergarments, which are actually not that exciting. You know, corsets, whatever, blah, blah, blah. There is a whole story about it, but...
But then there was Klondike Kate.
Well, first we're going to go to the drawers.
Oh, of course.
So, the typical undergarment, basically what we would call panties now, was this pantaloon thing that had a slit, and everybody's drawers had a slit. They didn't have like buttons or, you know, ties or zippers, so when these ladies would lift their legs up, you could pretty much see everything. It wasn't like a big
So it was a lot more
mystery.
racy than you see in Gunsmoke and these other things, because
Right.
you could, it was a full Monty, if you will.
Oh, totally.
Um,
With frills and lace and all of that, but pretty much you saw everything. So back to Klondike Kate. Her and her troupe in a mining town
in the Yukon.
in the Yukon, dancing, and one of them, actually the mining, whatever, foreman offended one of the ladies. It wasn't even her. Catcalling them and calling them whores and all of that. And what did she say?
Well, she went with her troupe, marched down there right after the show.
Into the mining camp.
So they get the message at the show that one of the waitresses has been harassed by this foreman. Klondike Kate's like, well, that's not acceptable. Early feminist hero, in my opinion. So her and her troupe marched down, still in their big frilly thing, to the camp and says, where's this foreman that, you know, assaulted this waitress? And he shows up with all his miners, and they start calling her a whore. Yeah, that didn't work out too well for the miners. After most of them ended up picking up their teeth and getting into a fight, she got arrested along with her troupe as a gang. And when the judge said, "How, you know, why would you go there and injure 15 miners?" This troupe injured 15 miners in their own area in high heels. By that. She said, "Nobody calls me a whore." So that is the story of Klondike Kate. There's lots of great shady lady feminists in mine. There's Madame Mustache, a French lady who
really had a mustache.
Yeah, and it wasn't one of these little Frida Kahlo mustaches. It was like my mustache.
It was a real mustache.
And she ran bordels, was also the person who popularized blackjack in 21 in the Old West, was a major gambler, and an early feminist.
Yes.
And that's the other thing. The Victorian age really is the beginning of feminism, and things like, you know, free love movement, that didn't start in the 60s. That started in the Victorian time. Now, of course, the Shakers, who believed in no sex whatsoever, also were at the Victorian time. So you had this real dialogue, but not in words like we're having, but a real dialogue about sex, women's bodies, men's bodies, what you could or could not do to them. It's a very fascinating period of time. And to be honest, we're still Victorians. We're still Victorian. I mean, just the thought that you have to be 18 for some reason. No, again, it's not, I'm sure the organizers didn't want to do it either, but just because of society that you had to be 18 to come in here, where there's nothing really that sexy, other than me a little bit, I know. It's okay. There's nothing that sexy going on here, but you know, it's the same kind of Victorian idea that we want to know about it, but we want to keep other people away from it. And you know, this is a kind of hypocrisy that the Victorians dealt with all the time, because everybody was doing it, and they were doing it in all sorts of kinky, weird ways, but nobody wanted to talk about it, but everybody wanted to read about it.
I actually wanted to, on that idea, the idea that everyone wants to read about it, but not actually be known for it in public, I was actually going to talk a bit about modern steampunk erotica.
Sure.
So there's actually a lot of modern steampunk erotica. There's a ridiculous number of them. When steampunk was kind of first taking off as a subculture about 5 years ago, like some of the first stuff that really appeared, a lot of the new books that were coming out were all dirty steampunk stories, which I certainly don't blame anyone for. And actually, my first published stories as Margaret Killjoy are actually erotica, and had a fun story where my mom Googled my name, and because believe it or not, Margaret Killjoy is not the name I was born with, and my mom's name is Margaret too, but that's a whole other awkward story. So she Googles my name, one night, we're out at dinner, I'm visiting, she says, "So, I Googled Margaret Killjoy. I see that you do a lot of different types of writing." I was like, Yeah, I paid my rent. Just like, okay. And that's the only
His
conversation.
cow died, he needed a
I know, right? The cow was dead. Like, the cows don't buy themselves. I don't know why I have a cow.
You need one.
But I'm vegan. I probably just have to be friends with it, and they're kind of annoying. Anyway,
cows.
And but one of my favorite contemporary steampunk erotica authors is, or just erotic authors in general, is named Shannon Germain, who we interview in Steampunk Magazine. And specifically, she actually writes under her legal name, and she writes dirty stories, and she writes other stories too. And this is just like really not done. So in many ways, we are still living in this Victorian era where like people like pretend like they don't have sex. People pretend like that kink doesn't exist. And I would actually say this does a grave disservice. Because if you find a culture that like actually is going to talk about power dynamics, is actually going to talk about consent, is actually going to talk about these issues that are really important about keeping people safe,
It's gonna be kink.
you're talking about the kink community, you're talking about the BDSM community, and you're talking about geek communities, and you're talking about these communities that actually like are willing to be like out and open about whatever type of sexuality they are. You can be as vanilla as you want and still actually talk about this shit. But people are really embarrassed about it in mainstream society, and they really don't need to be. So I just wanted to like, so there is a lot of really good steampunk erotica out there, and there's actually starting to be steampunk porn. Obviously the porn industry as is a whole nother bag of kettles of chips, or whatever the metaphor that I just fucked up is.
A sack or something.
So I'm not gonna really like get into that. There's a lot of feminist implications and different things. But I think we're gonna move into questions.
We want to talk about the dingler, and we want to use this.
Oh, right,
Yes,
yeah.